Welcome everyone to the 43rd Hands-on Agile meetup. And today it's my great pleasure to welcome Jeff Gothelf to the meetup. And I'm really looking forward to that. Jeff is very well known author and speaker, and you probably know him from co-authoring the Lean UX book and Sense and Respond, and his recent book, Forever Employable. So, Jeff, would you like to take over? The stage is yours.
Sure. Thank you. Hey, folks. Thanks, Stefan. It's a pleasure to be here. Nice to see everybody. Thanks for joining. Stefan mentioned the topic today is outcome-based product planning, which is a really interesting topic because it's a difficult topic. It is something that keeps organizations from managing the outcomes because managing the output's a lot easier. And we're going to talk about why that is in just a second. Okay, so that's the focus of the conversation today. How to plan work when you're managing to outcomes. And we'll talk a little bit about output versus outcome. We're going to talk a little bit about OKRs. But let's start off with this question here, right? What do people love about the products that they love? Right? What is it that when someone says, I love my phone, or I love Netflix, or I love, Amazon, whatever service or product they love, I'll tell you what they never say. Right? What they never say is, I love Netflix because it was delivered on time. Right. I love my iPhone because it was delivered on budget. Right? Oh, that Amazon feature shipped on the date that they told me it would ship. That's not why I love it. Right? People never say that's why they love it. People love their products because it meets a need or it solves a specific problem for them, right? And what's interesting is that this is the way that the people that we serve, the people who consume the products and services that we create, this is the way that they define success. In addition, this is the way that we should be defining success with our products and services. And if we start to reframe how we measure success, then it changes how we plan our work and it changes how we communicate about our work and about the work that we're going to do. Now, the interesting thing is that we have to start to take a look at a shift from linear product planning to continuous product planning. Now, there was a time, or there is a time, let's be honest, where linear product planning makes sense. Right? When we know exactly what the end state is going to be, when there's a high level of certainty and a low level of risk, we know exactly what it's supposed to look like. We know everything that's going to go into the product. We know exactly how it's going to be used. And in those situations, we can plan the work linearly because there is very little variability or risk in the final product, in the thing that we actually make. And there was a time where this also made sense for digital products and services, for software. Now, that time was a long time ago. It was when software came in a box. And I was perhaps fortunate, perhaps not fortunate to be working during that time. And we planned software linearly back then because software had a definitive end, because at some point, we had to go and print millions of copies of CDs and put them in boxes and get them out to the store. So you could go to the store and buy a box of software, which sounds ridiculous today. And in those situations where there is a clear and definitive end to the project, where there is a certainty about what we're going to ship and when we're going to ship it and what it's going to look like when it's done, we used a planning tool called the roadmap. And the roadmap is a great metaphor for linear product planning, right? In low risk, high certainty situations, it's easy to communicate our plans in a linear fashion. And a map is a great metaphor for that. We're going to start at point A, we're going to end at point B, and the amount of time and distance between those 2 points. And it's going to take us this much time to traverse that distance. And that's when we'll arrive at point B and have the desired result. And that, particularly when it comes to technology products and software products, that made sense in a static software world. But today, we don't live in a static software world. We live and work and consume in a continuous world, right? We live in a world that's driven by software. Technology drives everything. And the software that drives everything is continuous. It updates continuously. Nobody goes to the store and buys a box of software anymore. The software just simply updates on our devices. It updates online. We send updates to enterprise systems, and our ability to update these systems and to continuously improve them is getting faster and faster and faster and faster. In fact, just to kind of put a fine line on it, today, Amazon ships code to production once every second. Once a second. Some Amazon customer in the world experiences a change in the system. And that might be the extreme end of things, but that's what's possible today. And in that world, the delivery of software becomes a non-event, right? So if you think about linear product planning, the delivery of the software was an event. It was a big event, in fact, because we've been working on this thing for 6 months or 12 months or 24 months or whatever it was, and we shipped it. And the fact that we shipped it was a big deal. We had a party every time. We got a t-shirt with the name of the project on the t-shirt. I had tens of these t-shirts back in the day. But today, if you can get code out into production once every second, once every minute, every hour, every day, every week, then the delivery of software becomes a non-event. It's not a measure of success anymore. Now, that starts to complicate how we define success and how we plan our work when we can deliver code that fast. But it gets even more challenging because today, there are so many more people who have access to technology. There are so many more people who use our products and services and have experience with it, and diversity of the humans who use our products and services drives complex behavior. Human behavior is complex. It is also highly unpredictable. And in many cases, behavior emerges from the use of our system. So even if we believe that we know what people will do, and even if they do those things initially, over time, people start to use our systems to do things that we never expected. And we've seen that in a variety of different situations, including social media, where initially, social media was just used to connect people, to find dates, perhaps, to keep track of what family and friends are doing from far away. And then these days, social media can also be used, perhaps the emergent behavior there has been a little negative, to subvert elections and spread misinformation. Nobody really expected that initially, right? People do things that we don't expect, and that starts to complicate our planning process as well. Now, the other thing too with product planning is that we can make a plan, but because the world is continuous and because the pace of change is so rapid and because so much stuff can take place between the time that we confirm the plan and the time that we ship the product, it doesn't mean that the thing that we planned still makes sense when we actually ship it. Right? We planned for it, and by the time we got it out to market, well, the market moved on. And the thing doesn't make sense, or it doesn't work as we hoped, or people don't do the thing that we expected them to do because maybe some new competition came to light in the market, or some new behavior or consumption pattern emerged while we were developing. And so what's interesting about this is that when we plan work in a linear fashion, we create these rigid plans. And rigidity, right, the rigid nature of linear product road mapping is the enemy of agility. If we want to be very, very explicit about it, they're a lie. We're lying to ourselves, we're lying to our bosses, we're lying to our consumers if we think we can predict what we're going to be working on in 6 months, 9 months, or let alone a year. And the interesting thing about this is that we set expectations with these linear roadmaps about dates, about features, about ROI, right? Here's how much money we're going to make off of this thing. And then we're on the hook for it, which is super risky for us, just as practitioners, as people who like to stay employed, right? What if something new emerges? What if there's a new competitive threat? What if there is human behavior changes, a consumption pattern, a disruptive product? What if there's a pandemic? Right? What are we going to do? How are we going to adjust this thing that we've committed to, right? It's on paper, we've negotiated it, we fought for it, and there it is, right? I'll tell you a quick story that sort of illustrates this. In 2008, which feels like 1,000 years ago now, but in 2008, I took a new job in October of 2008. It was back in New York, and I became the director of user experience at a company called The Ladders, which was a high growth startup, a job board for people who made $100,000 or more. Now, I took that job at the beginning of October 2008. We had a 9-month roadmap and a clear plan, a linear roadmap of what we're going to build, the ROI of that, exactly what we're going to do. And I was starting to not only build my team, but to help the organization execute that roadmap. Now, if you remember that far back, 1,000 years ago in 2008, particularly October 2008, that was a bad month for the economy. Particularly initially the US economy, and then lucky for everybody else, it spread globally. But 3 weeks after I started my job in New York City, Lehman Brothers melted down. The brokerage house collapsed, and the financial crisis of 2008 began. This is 3 weeks after I started my new job. Now, remember, we were in the business of matching high earners with employers, right? So executive job search with people. And for that system to work well, it's like a dating system. It's a two-sided marketplace. You've got to have a balanced supply of employers and job seekers. And we did for the first 3 weeks that I worked there. And then overnight, Lehman Brothers melted down, and all of a sudden the ecosystem looks like this. No jobs, lots of job seekers, right? Literally overnight. It doesn't usually happen like that, but in this case, we went home, we came back the next day, and the system was flooded with new job seekers. The challenge here was that what were we going to do? We had a 9-month roadmap. We had a plan, and we'd negotiated, and people had committed that. And do we follow the plan, or do we adjust course? And so it's the question that we have to keep asking ourselves with linear product planning. How can we respond effectively, right? We can't be agile. We can't inspect and adapt, sense and respond, build, measure, learn, think, make, check, whatever your favorite phrase is. We can't do that if we commit to these linear, rigid plans, because the world will, I guarantee it, the world will throw obstacles, challenges, surprises, competitors at us, and they will break our plans. And it will challenge the organization's inertia that comes behind the hours of work and negotiation that it took to finalize this list of features and dates that we agreed to. And so we've really got to move kind of beyond this rigid product planning and redefine it away from focusing on the delivery of specific features by specific dates and much more towards delivering outcomes. And so we need a different way of planning work. And so we're going to talk about that for the rest of the conversation today, which is, what does an outcome-based product plan look like? How do we actually build something that doesn't fix scope and time and gives us the flexibility to react, to respond to the market, to geopolitical shifts, to pandemics, to whatever it is? The first step in outcome-based product planning is to change the question that we're asking as we start to define our work. The old question is, what will we build, right? That's always been the question. And people still ask that today. What are we making? What are we building? And again, this fixes us in a feature-based and output-based conversation. Instead, we want to change the question. The new question that we need to start to ask if we're going to shift our planning process is, what will people be doing differently if we succeed? And let's be clear, succeed means we understand the customer problem, we choose a set of features to deliver, and we do a great job designing, developing, and implementing those features, right? What will people be doing differently if we succeed? The old question fixes us in output thinking, feature-based thinking. What are we making? The new question focuses us on outcomes. How will people's behavior change if we do a great job? In other words, how do we know we've done a great job? What will people be doing differently if we succeed? And that's the first thing that we want to start doing, is starting to change that conversation. So when someone says, hey, what are we building? And we could say, well, instead of talking about that, maybe the question should be, regardless of what we choose to build, if we do a great job, what do we hope to see people doing differently? And that's a nice way to start to shift that conversation at work. The second step in the process is to change how we view our work. A lot of us are really fixed. I think a lot of organizations, certainly the ones I work with, are fixed in this inside out view of the world, right? That we know what's best. We understand our customers. We're going to push out these products into the world and they're going to love them, right? Instead, we have to start taking this outside in view, a customer-centered view onto the work that we're doing. Because look, the majority of us, with exception, to be fair, but the majority of us are not geniuses delivering magic products to people who don't know they need them. I mean, there are people like that who exist, and they're very lucky to be those folks. But the majority of us are empathetic problem solvers for our users that give them solutions that make them more successful. So instead of saying, here is my genius idea that I know you love, let me go outside in and say, let me understand what problem you're having. And then let me see how I can best give you something that will make you more successful. And it's changing that conversation from, I'm going to give you something, to I'm actually going to make you more successful. And we'll know I'm more successful when their behavior changes, right? Now, the third step in determining how to build a product plan around outcomes is you have to change the destination. And this is where we get into kind of the tactical conversation is, right? So I love this quote from Tammy Rice. She says, a roadmap is a marketing tool with your plans for the coming quarter and year, which means that we can adjust the marketing for our work as we learn new information. And that's the goal in our outcome-based product plan. And this is at a very high level and at a generic level, I'll be honest, right? What an outcome-based roadmap or an outcome-based product plan can look like. So let's start at the top. At the top, we are going to list the long-term or the longer-term strategic theme for the team. This is kind of the objective if you're familiar with OKRs, and we'll talk about OKRs in just a second, right? But this is the O in OKRs, right? What is the objective that this team is working on for the next 6, 9, or 12 months, right? What's the goal for this particular team? Next, we set quarterly key result targets for the team to hit. So in Q1, we really want to focus on acquisition of new customers. In Q2, we may still want to focus on acquisition, but also activating those customers, and maybe looking forward into 3 and 4, we're going to start to shift into retention mode. But we want to get a sense of what we believe the behavior changes are that we should be targeting on a quarterly basis. Now, I'm using quarters for a few reasons. Number one, it's common. A lot of organizations work with quarters. Number two, it's shorter than a year. And anything shorter than your current planning cycle, and for most organizations, a year is what their planning cycle is, but anything that you're doing shorter than your current planning cycle is a step in the right direction. So I'm using quarters here as an illustration, but if that doesn't make sense in your world, if that needs to be 6 months, or if it can be shorter even, then you can adjust that. But the cycle time here is a quarter, and we're going to commit to key results on a quarterly basis based on what we know today, okay? Now, in the short term, we can start to take fairly good educated guesses, assumptions, also known as hypotheses, about what we will work on this quarter and maybe a little bit in the next quarter as well, right? We believe that here are the 6, 7, 8 things that may help us achieve our key result goals. And next quarter, there are 3 or 4 things that we're also thinking about working on. Now, these are hypotheses. We are not committing to delivering every single thing in this list. In fact, the commitment that we're making is to the key result at the top of the quarter. That's what we're committing to, that behavior change, that outcome. And if we find along the way that the hypotheses that we've listed, the work that we've identified for this quarter isn't driving that behavior change, we are going to pivot. We are going to kill that idea or change it, or figure out something that may actually achieve that goal. Now, the interesting thing here, and this is where this gets tougher, I think, from a conversation with stakeholders, is that the further out in time that we look, the less accurately we can predict the work that we're going to be doing. Right? We talked about the rigidity of linear product planning, right? If you think you can predict what you'll be working on 9 months or 12 months from now, most of us are going to be wrong, right? And so we don't want to make any strong commitments beyond, a quarter ahead. So like we've got a fairly high level of confidence in the current quarter, a slightly lower level of confidence in the subsequent quarter. Beyond that, it's anybody's guess. And so we want to be super clear about that. Now, what's interesting is that as we start to work in this quarter, we are starting to collect evidence. And that evidence is going to impact our backlog of work. We're going to ship some ideas, we're going to kill some ideas, we're going to pivot on some ideas, and it's going to give us more confidence in the next quarter's work. And so when we reach the end of each quarterly cycle, we can adjust our levels of certainty a quarter ahead. So we can be a lot more confident in the second quarter, slightly more confident in the third quarter, and maybe start to add things into Q4, right? We're shifting our time horizon, kind of the time horizon within which we have certainty based on the evidence that we're collecting along the way. And we can do that on a quarterly basis if we have these kind of quarterly check-ins, right? We can check in on a quarterly basis and say, how are we trending towards our key results? What are we learning? What did we ship, right? And what do we think we need to do next quarter in order to achieve the key results? Do the key results for the next quarter make sense? And if they do, what do we need to do to move that forward? So we're kind of shifting our window of certainty forward in time with evidence. The best metaphor that I've come up with to sort of help this concept hit home is this idea of walking through a fog. If you've ever walked through a fog, then this should hopefully resonate. And I've built a lovely fog animation here. In a second, you'll see it kind of come in here. It took me a long time, so give it some time to build in here. But if you ever walk through a fog, you know that you can see 3 or 4 steps ahead, but you can't see 10 or 15 steps ahead. And so you're not going to be running full speed ahead or driving full speed ahead into a fog. You're going to drive slowly, right? Work in small batches, go a bit of a distance. And then as you move forward 4 steps, you reveal the next 4 steps. And you can see whether or not the road is clear ahead. And if it is, terrific, keep going that way. And you reveal the subsequent 4 steps. But maybe at one of those points, you actually reveal that there's a brick wall in front of you, or there's a tree, and you need to turn left, or you need to turn right. Right? That's exactly what we're doing here. We're revealing the next couple of steps by taking a few steps, and we're increasing our confidence in the direction that we're moving in. That's the focus with this way of working, okay? Let's get a bit more specific about how we actually do this, how we build the components that fall into this. The first thing that we want to do is we want to start with a clear business problem. This is really important because most teams start with a solution to implement. We want to start with a problem to solve. So I'm going to give you an example in this particular case. This is an online education service for lawyers, continuing education service for lawyers to maintain their credentials that we're running. We've observed that our customers sign up for an account, take one of our courses, and then don't come back. And this decreases the benefit of their continuing education. It's expensive for us to continuously acquire new customers. And so we need to fix this. This is the business problem that we are going to work on in the next quarter or 2. What we then do is we want to think about, well, strategically, what's the goal here? If we turn this business problem into a positive goal, right, then we look at it from a positive lens. If we solve that problem, then we're building an effective and engaging continuing education learning product for the entirety of a lawyer's career to ensure that their skills are current, right? So ideally, for that problem turned into a positive statement could look like this. And what this is, that's our objective. That's our strategic goal that goes at the top of that outcome-based product plan. Then we ask the key question, right? If we solve that problem, if we achieve that objective, what will people be doing differently? And now we start to list the behavior change that will tell us that we've actually solved the problem and built this compelling continuing education program, right? So every user that we have will take at least 3 courses each year. 25% of new customers will come from word of mouth referrals. And every law firm that signs up registers at least 50% of its staff. These are measures of behavior, their outcomes, or their key results, right? These are the goals that we can set up on a quarterly basis to tell us what we're signing up for. And what we've essentially done here is exactly that. We've written our first OKR statement, and then we can take that OKR and we can map it to that diagram that I showed you, right? So we put our strategic theme at the top, we put our KRs on each quarter, and those become our quarterly plan goals. Now, once we've got those quarterly plan goals, we can work together to brainstorm solution hypotheses that we think will help us achieve those OKRs, right? And so the template that we're using here, this is a template that comes right out of the Lean UX book for hypotheses. This could be one way that we might actually achieve the key result, right? We believe we'll increase the number of classes taken by each customer by 300%, right? If mid-career lawyers feel like they're progressing ahead of average rates in their career with a leaderboard of internal and external usage statistics. So we're going to gamify the process. That's the feature. That's the hypothesis. And we can write a bunch of these things, right? We can brainstorm these together. And those hypotheses become our quarterly activities, right? They populate that list. These are the things that we're going to work towards that we think that will achieve our key results. As we prioritize that list, the next step in the process is to determine the risks in those hypotheses. And then, of course, design experiments to test them. Our goal is not to just ship stuff and hope that it works unless we're highly confident in it, right? Our goal is to make sure that the thing that we're building will actually achieve the desired behavior change. And if it doesn't, we want to shift gears. We want to move off of that and pivot off of that as quickly as possible, right? That's the agility component that we're building into outcome-based product planning, right? Is that if the evidence from our experiments contradicts the key result goals, the outcome goals, well, we want to get off that very quickly. And I love this. This is an experiment in Rotterdam in the Netherlands where they're trying to figure out where to put bike racks. They have ideas about where to put bike racks, but instead of just putting down a bunch of concrete and hoping that it'll work, they've got this mobile bike rack. They see if people use it, and then they commit if people actually change their behavior and start locking their bikes to this thing. Okay. Now, we talked a little bit about these quarterly check-ins. They're super important. I want to be very specific about the kinds of questions that you want to ask in these quarterly check-ins. So we start working for a quarter. At the end of that quarter, we get together. And remember, it's really, really important that these quarters are forward-looking. In other words, no one should be surprised about anything we're going to share at those. And there's a responsibility here for the team to communicate proactively over the course of their work about what's happening. Instead, we want a forward-looking conversation that asks, how are we trending towards our targets? What are we learning? Are the hypotheses we're currently working on true or false? Should we change the backlog? What will we keep funding, right? What initiatives should we keep working on? What should we kill? Should we keep funding this? Should we even be chasing this problem any further? Does it still make sense? Are there things we should pivot on, things we should kill? Are there new ideas that we've come up with, right? These are the kinds of conversations we want to have at our quarterly check-ins to help move the conversation forward. Now, I talked about it as without being really deliberate about it. And so I want to call out that if you're going to work this way, if you're going to try to convince your teams to plan work with outcomes, to manage towards customer behaviors, this way of working and this way of product planning explicitly requires you to do product discovery. It requires you to do design thinking, lean startup, lean UX, product discovery, whatever you want to call it, right? It's the testing, the experimentation, the learning, the customer conversations, the research that informs you about whether or not your hypotheses are actually going to deliver the outcomes that you're targeting. And if your organization isn't particularly good at product discovery, you will have to train that organization. And if you happen to know how to do it, but the organization doesn't enable discovery to take place, we have to start to identify the blockers for product discovery and start to unblock them. Because without this, the outcome-based product planning doesn't work, right? Because if you'll notice, right, in the objectives and the key results that are our goals, the measure of success is not the delivery of a specific feature, it's the delivery of a behavior change. And our hypotheses are just guesses, right? These are the things that we think might get us there. And so we have to test which ones are actually going to get us there. As we start to build these roadmaps, you're absolutely going to face some challenges from your colleagues and your stakeholders. This is not going to be easy, right? One of the hardest things that you're going to have to manage is there's going to be pushback and anxiety. One of those reasons for the anxiety is that managers, particularly middle managers and stakeholders, are used to telling people what to do. And we are now saying, look, the team is going to determine what to do based on evidence. They're going to brainstorm some ideas, they're going to run some experiments, and based on their learnings, they're going to reprioritize their work, because the goal is not to deliver a specific set of features, it's to change behavior. And so it's really important to understand what are people going to do, how managers' behaviors are going to change, right? And this question will come up a lot, particularly in folks who are used to very clearly and very deliberately and explicitly telling teams what to do. Because remember, we're taking that away from them, right? What do I do? If my job is not to tell people what to do, then what's my job? And I think that if you're in a position where you're leading teams, or you've got somebody who's managing your team, and we're going to start to get them towards this outcome way of thinking, their job is to help define, communicate, and clarify strategy, to make sure you're on track, to set guardrails and scope, right? We're focused on the mobile channel only, right? This is what we're working on. Help you make key decisions or break some ties. Their job is absolutely to remove obstacles, to make it easy for you to do product discovery, whatever it is you need to do, and whatever else that provides you with the tools, the data, the analytics that help you be more successful. That's their job, right? Now, in return, if we're going to ask our managers and our stakeholders to change how they do their job, we have to take on, as members of the team, there's a responsibility for us to make it easier for them to be successful in this new reality, right? Because this is the number one question that they're asking themselves. What if my boss comes to me and asks me what the team is doing, and I don't know the answer because I didn't tell them what to do? This is where our responsibilities come in as a team. As a team, we have to practice radical transparency. This is where we step up to make our bosses successful in this new way of thinking. We have to practice radical transparency, which means over-communicating both up the chain as well as out to our colleagues. Every time we communicate, every time we make a decision, we want to support that decision with data. We are pivoting here because we learned X from this experiment. We're killing this idea and shifting to another idea because this is the feedback that we got, right? We always want to reference the key results as the goal, right? We're not killing a feature because we didn't like it or because it was hard to implement. We're killing it because the data says, the evidence says that it is not moving us towards our key results. And most importantly, right, checking in after every short cycle with the stakeholder, after every sprint. Hey, listen, this is what we learned. Come to the sprint review meeting. All right, let me give you a quick recap of what happened. The responsibility is on us to get these folks the data, the information that they need, so they're calm. And when they're calm, they stay out of our way and they let us do our work. One other obstacle that you're absolutely going to run into is sales, right? Sales is going to say, listen, I need to know what you're building so I can sell it, right? How can I sell it if I don't know what's coming? If you're going to change the roadmap on me, potentially in 3, 4, or 5 weeks, how can I sell anything? And that's a fair question, right? And so we want to work, first of all, we want to involve the sales teams in that over communication so they know exactly what you're doing and why. And then most importantly, we want to work with them to help them sell the benefit, not the feature. So instead of saying, we're going to give you calendar integration, right? Go sell calendar integration. We're going to say, we're going to make sure that nobody ever misses another meeting again in your company. Go sell that, right? Sell the benefit, not the feature. Go sell the fact that no one will ever miss a meeting again, right? I don't know if that's a benefit or not, but that would be certainly an outcome that would come of that, right? So we're speaking in outcomes. And then those outcomes inevitably have financial impact, right? We're going to increase the productivity of your team. You're going to save this much money. You're going to reduce this much waste. And so the sales conversation can change as well because the tactical implementation will inevitably vary, right? Remember, we're building these continuous systems. They never end. And so we have the opportunity to improve them in the future, particularly if we haven't committed in the sales process to very explicit things. I understand that that's difficult. But that's the kind of conversation we need to have with our sales folks. The more they're involved in these discussions with us, the more they're part of this over communication, the easier this gets. Look, this is where agility comes from, right? Managing to outcomes ensures that we're paying attention to how well our work is meeting the needs of our customers, right? If we're not changing their behavior in a positive way, we have objective measures for that, and we can adjust our work to reflect that. We can objectively say, look, the work that we're doing is not achieving the goal, and so we need to change the work. This fits beautifully into agile short cycles, right? Sprints, because those sprints give us the opportunity to minimize our investments in our hypotheses, in our feature ideas. And if we find out that those feature ideas aren't going to help us achieve our key results or our outcomes, then we can pivot from that. We've got the evidence to do that. And then ultimately, this forces us to continuously learn and build that inspect and adapt from Scrum, that build, measure, learn from lean startup, that ship, sense, and respond from sense and respond into the process, and gives us that course correction, right? Because outcome-based product planning is objective. We're making these decisions based on the data, and it helps us use evidence to convince our colleagues, our stakeholders, and our sales teams to come along. And then ultimately, outcome-based product planning helps us stop lying to ourselves and to our bosses, right? We start to be more honest about what we're actually going to build and when it's going to happen and why we think it's actually valuable. So look, I hope that was helpful, and I hope that gave you some ideas to think about. We've got time for questions, and so I'll hand it back to Stefan, who hopefully can navigate us through any questions or conversations that may have come up while I was talking.
Excellent, Jeff. Spot landing. We indeed have a few questions, and I'd like to follow up with one question that's closely related to the sales stuff that you were talking about. So, question. In order to gain new clients, sales management commit to prospect a new feature to be delivered on the existing platform by X date. How do we change the mindset and the narrative of these sales/leaders?
There's a lot of language nuance, I think, that we can use, right? And you can argue, well, Jeff, that's just spin or it's just marketing. And well, I don't necessarily disagree. It does start to get us into a more realistic perception of the nature of software. So instead of feature, right, we can say functionality. We're going to deliver calendar integration functionality by 1st of August. That's great. What's the feature? Maybe it's just a Wizard of Oz. Maybe it's just a few of us sitting in the office and plugging in dates into a calendar for you. But it enables the feature. And again, the key thing here is that the functionality is never done. We get a sense of how well it worked. We get a sense of how many people are using it. We get a sense if there's actual traction with it. And then we can decide if we want to invest further in solidifying it, expanding it, scaling it, etc. And so I think the narrative becomes, we're going to deliver some level of functionality. I'll give you an example. It was a marketing tool for small businesses. And it was for a big credit card company that we were building. This was back in New York City when I was living in New York. We built the system knowing full well that it could not scale beyond 1,000 users. Right? That was an explicit decision that we made to ship this thing, to ship these functions that could not scale beyond 1,000 users. We knew that the client had tens of thousands of users. The idea was to get something out there by a particular date that did something, that offered some level of functionality, that gave us an opportunity to test whether or not this was actually valuable, this was the right direction to do it. And then that data allowed us to iterate and improve that over time. So really changing the language from feature to function, and this idea that it's never done, we're going to make it better over time, is critical to the success here as well. And I'll be honest with you really quick about that particular story. This small team is about 4 engineers on there. We had 3 of them who were fully on board with this, and we had 1 engineer. He could not, in good faith, he could, eventually did it, right? But he struggled to build this system that he knew was going to break if it had more than 1,000 users. I'm not bad-mouthing him. He was an excellent engineer, and he worried about quality, right? He's like, this is not a high-quality product. And he was right. It wasn't a high-quality product by design. We were going to make it higher quality over time if it proved the value, if it achieved the outcome and the goals. It's a different language, right? But it starts to get the conversation headed in the right direction.
Okay, another related question. How to transform from a classic feature-based roadmap to a goal-oriented approach? What would be the first 3 or 4 steps in a 5,000 people organization?
First of all, it's about asking different questions, right? So the question always becomes, what are we going to build? Right? Well, not what we're going to build, like what's the behavior change we're seeking? What will people be doing differently if we succeed is a great way to start that conversation, right? What problem are we solving, right? When someone says, go build me this blue button and ship it by Friday, right? And make it big. You're like, great, what problem does that solve? Well, it solves the problem that people keep failing out of the checkout process. Oh, people keep failing out of the checkout process? Do we know why? No, we don't. Okay, let's go figure that out. Right? And then let's build stuff that actually changes their behavior, and just instead of just assuming that a big blue button is going to do that. And so we start to change the conversations, right? And then we start to redefine success from make me a blue button to reduce shopping cart dropout by 90%, right? And all of a sudden, right, blue button might do that, red button might do that, longer checkout process, shorter checkout process, all kinds of ways to solve for that. But we really want to start to change the conversation from build me a thing to solve this problem and change this behavior, right? That's the goal. But there's a lot more stuff back in the presentation.
Next question, now in a chronological order. What to do when the product requires many development teams?
Yeah, really good question, right? So scaling is really interesting. And there's an article on my blog that addresses this a little bit. But the short of this, and I will give credit where it's due, the idea that I have for this came from Mary Poppendijk. It came because I was lucky enough to be sitting at a panel next to her in Sweden, I think, a whole bunch of years ago. But the short of it is, if we've got multiple development teams, which we normally do, then one way, and I'm not saying this is the only way, but one way that you can align them is to give a set of teams the same OKR, the same outcome goal to achieve. Now, what does that do? Well, first of all, it binds those teams together in a shared goal, right? So those teams have to work together. So they have to figure out how to self-organize, how to communicate, how to share knowledge, how to share learning, how to share information. And also it reminds those teams that they win or lose together. Even if we start to kind of divide leading indicators among those teams and one team does really well, if other teams don't achieve their goals, we fail, right? Because we've got the same goal here together. And so that's one way to do that, is to take a set of teams and then to give them the same outcome to achieve, and then really kind of let them go. They'll figure out how to self-organize in most cases.
So next question, very interesting. The emphasis on teams that includes all of the many stakeholders implies that everyone needs to have a basic understanding on every aspect of product and delivery. Do you agree that people do not exist in intellectual silos?
I hope that people do not exist in intellectual silos and that they broaden their perspective on the world by seeking other ideas. Look, the reality is my emphasis is on cross-functional teams. Those cross-functional teams should have a good sense of the strategy, the product strategy that they're working on, the goal that they're working on, and some level of understanding of what their colleagues do, right? So the people on their team, they don't have to write code per se, they don't have to do design work per se, but they have to get a sense, they have to understand what everybody on the team does, and to kind of respect the fact that they may have their own process, they have their own vocabulary, and to start to build that collaboration as part of the work together. That, to me, is the foundational level of needs that a team requires to be successful. I'm not sure if that answered the question, but I think everyone needs to have a very clear understanding of the strategy and the goal and what their colleagues are there to do. Again, you don't have to be an expert in their field, right? But you have to get a sense of kind of how the process works. And then the collaboration can build from there. So yes, I think I do believe that that's required.
Okay, here's a great question. It is one thing to try to support the middle managers to accept the fog. One of the challenges I see is if the team composition to define the product delivery, more specifically the dev team. From my experience, there are developers that like to be part of those decisions, but a lot of them like to code. What would be your recommendation to bring them into the product outcome?
You have to invite them. I mean, that sounds really basic, right? Like invite them to the conversation that you want them to be in. But that's a good place to start. Ask them to come. If they don't show up, ask them why they didn't show up. Look, it's 2022. And I think that in most organizations today, I don't know that it's true, but I'd like to believe that in 2022, this idea of a developer who the only thing that they do at work is put on their headphones and write code is out of date. I'm sure those jobs exist. I just don't think that that's the right job description for a software engineer in 2022. And so that starts to challenge hiring and job descriptions and performance management criteria and that type of thing. But some aspect of software development, software engineering needs to include customer understanding, outcomes discussions, collaboration with colleagues. You don't have to lead that. You don't have to drive it, but you do have to participate in it in some way. And your bosses you need to recognize that you will be spending some of your time doing that kind of work, because that's going to help you write better code. And so that's how I feel about it. I know that's not the full reality yet, but I think that that's critical. It's a critical change in sort of job descriptions for engineers in 2022 that needs to happen.
Okay. Next question. Are there any tips on getting senior leadership to buy in with becoming more outcome-based from output?
Absolutely. The question was, are there any tips? This is a very tactical and practical tip. One exercise that we do with leaders, particularly stakeholders for a particular initiative, when we work with teams, is we visualize the connection between impact metrics, so KPIs, the things that end up on executive dashboards, things like profit, revenue, sales, satisfaction, et cetera, with outcomes. We literally visualize it, right? So what outcomes are leading indicators of sales, revenue, profit, retention, et cetera. And the outcomes are very tactical measures of what people do in the system. They land on the homepage, they create an account, they come back, they sign in, they add something to cart, they add a second thing to cart, they check out, right? All of these different things. And we visualize that connection for them. The first benefit of that is that you're not talking about features, which is good. That's a good start. The second benefit of that is that you are making a very literal and visual connection for these folks that says, when people do this, we make money, right? When people do this, we save money, right? So that you're literally connecting the dots for them very, very, very visually. So that's very helpful, because again, now you're saying, oh, maybe if we did more of that, we'd save more money. If we did more of that, we'd make more money, right? And then we say, okay, great. Now, if you do this exercise for real, like over the course of maybe an hour or two, you really kind of build this tree, you're going to end up with dozens of Post-it notes, digital Post-it notes or physical Post-it notes on the wall. And so then the question becomes to the executives that you're working with in this exercise, well, strategically, of the 50 things, 50 behaviors, 100 behaviors that we have here on the wall, we have 10 product teams, we have 15 product teams. What are the 10 to 15 top behaviors you think that are strategically most important for us in the next 6 to 9 months? And so what we're asking them to do in that exercise is to say, well, I'd like the teams to focus on this behavior and this outcome and that key result. And that's great. And so all of a sudden we can say, okay, great. Now we've got 10 teams to go after these 10 outcomes. And we're going to come back to you with what we believe those teams are going to work on, not exactly, but that we believe those teams are going to do to help achieve this behavior change. It's a really nice way to start that conversation and to visualize it in a way that pretty much everybody gets. It's not a silver bullet, but everybody gets it.
We've come to the end of the time box. Your dog is waiting. It's been an amazing journey. Thank you so much for spending your evening with us and giving us insight into your experience.
It's been a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me, Stefan. It's nice to see you.
Thanks a lot.